What if the man who ruled Manhattan's skyline with glass towers and billion-dollar contracts discovered on a freezing New York night that the only thing strong enough to shatter his empire of silence was a little girl digging through the trash for a broken doll? If stories of redemption, justice, and unexpected family touch your heart, please like and subscribe so you can stay with us until the very last chapter of this journey. Snow was falling in Brooklyn like powdered glass shaken from a broken chandelier, each flake drifting down and catching the dim yellow light of a street lamp. It was past midnight, and the city seemed to hold its breath. Even the subway beneath the pavement rumbled with a muffled restraint, as if reluctant to disturb the silence. Alexander Reed stepped out of the back seat of his town car, the leather creaking as he adjusted his coat collar against the winter wind. 42 years old, he was the kind of man whose name appeared daily in the Wall Street Journal, a CEO who had shaped Manhattan's skyline with mirrored towers and quarterly reports that could move markets. Yet at this hour, after a grueling board meeting, he found himself wandering the streets of Brooklyn instead of retreating to the sterile comfort of his Upper East Side penthouse. His driver, a cautious man who had seen too many winters, had asked him twice if he wanted an escort. Alexander dismissed him with a wave. He didn't need company. Or at least, that's what he had been telling himself for years. The alley he passed was narrow, framed by graffiti-stained brick and overflowing trash bins. His shoes crunched on frozen slush. Then he heard it. A faint sound, not quite a cry, not quite a laugh. Something small and human in a place meant for what was discarded. He turned his head. There, half buried in the snow beside a dented green dumpster, was a little girl. 6 years old, maybe younger. Her hair was tangled, brown strands matted with frost, and her coat was 3 sizes too big, its zipper broken, sleeves frayed. She was on her knees, hands rummaging deep into a trash bag that smelled of stale bread and coffee grounds. Alexander froze. He wasn't sure if the sharp sting in his chest came from the wind or from something breaking loose inside him. "What are you doing?" His voice was lower, harsher than he intended. The girl startled, her small shoulders jerking. She turned slowly, and in her hands, held tight as if it were treasure, was a doll. Its dress was torn, its stuffing exposed through the seams, one eye missing. Yet she clutched it with a reverence that made Alexander's throat tighten. "I have to bring this to my sister," she said. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from cold. "She's in the hospital. She's never had a real toy before." For a moment, Alexander said nothing. Manhattan's empire builder, a man who negotiated billion-dollar deals, suddenly found himself incapable of forming words. He crouched down, his expensive wool coat brushing against the dirty snow. "What's your name?" "Sophie," she whispered. Her cheeks were red, raw from the wind. "Sophie Carter." The name seemed to echo in the alley, fragile and persistent. She hugged the broken doll to her chest, as if afraid he might take it away. Alexander studied her, this child who should have been asleep in a warm bed, not scavenging through trash on a December night. He opened his mouth to speak, but all the questions collided inside him. Where are your parents? Why are you alone? Why do you think this broken doll matters? But Sophie spoke first. "She's in the ICU," she said softly, her eyes shining with something fiercer than fear. "My sister Emily, she's 4. They say she's sick, but I think if she has a doll to hold, she won't feel so scared." Alexander felt something shift within him, a crack running through the wall he had spent years building. He wanted to look away, to retreat into the fortress of his indifference. Yet he could not. "You can't stay out here," he murmured. "It's too cold." Sophie shook her head. "I can't leave until I find something good enough. But this one, She looked down at the doll in her arms. This one will do. Her certainty pierced him more deeply than any accusation ever hurled in a boardroom. He saw in her small, trembling figure the fragility of all the children who never made it into glossy corporate reports. Alexander stood and extended a gloved hand. "Show me where your sister is," he said. She hesitated, her breath fogging in the air. For a second, distrust flickered in her eyes, an instinct born from too many nights alone. But something in his voice, perhaps the crack of truth in it, made her reach out. Her tiny fingers curled into his palm, and Alexander felt their coldness as a wound he could not ignore. They walked out of the alley together, the snow thickening around them. His polished shoes slipped once on the icy pavement, but Sophie never loosened her grip. She held the doll tight against her chest, her steps determined. For Alexander Reed, the man who had everything money could buy, this moment felt like stepping into a story he could neither predict nor control. A story written not in contracts or skyscrapers, but in the fragile heartbeat of a child carrying hope through a winter night. The driver, startled to see his employer return with a little girl in tow, rushed to open the door. Alexander helped Sophie climb into the warmth of the car. She sat on the leather seat, hugging the doll, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet lit by the faintest spark of relief. As the car pulled away from the alley, Alexander stared out at the snow swirling in the headlights. His chest felt heavier than it had in years, yet also strangely alive. He didn't know where this journey would lead, but one truth had already carved itself into him. For the first time in decades, his empire of silence had been broken, and it was a child who had done it. The town car pulled up to the entrance of New York Presbyterian Hospital, its headlights sweeping across the snow-slick pavement. The red neon letters glowed against the night sky, a beacon of both hope and despair. Alexander Reed stepped out first, his shoes sinking into the salted slush. Sophie climbed down after him, clutching her ragged doll against her chest as if it were a lifeline. Inside, the hospital was a contrast to the frozen alley they had left behind. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, nurses hurried down the corridors, and the faint smell of antiseptic clung to the air. Yet no warmth seemed to reach the girl's face. She pulled Alexander's hand gently, leading him with the certainty of a child who had memorized every hallway. "This way," Sophie whispered. They passed signs pointing toward Pediatric Intensive Care Unit, PICU. The words alone made Alexander's chest tighten. He had walked into countless conference rooms with glass tables and billion-dollar deals at stake, but never into a place where every breath might be borrowed time. At the sliding doors of the ICU, Sophie pressed the call button. A nurse glanced through the glass panel, recognized her, and buzzed them in. "Back again, sweetheart?" the nurse murmured kindly to Sophie. "Visiting hours are over." "I need to show him my sister," Sophie said firmly, nodding toward Alexander. The nurse's eyes flicked to the tall man in the wool overcoat, his presence too polished, too powerful for this ward of fragile bodies. She hesitated but then stepped aside, perhaps reading something unspoken in his expression. They entered. The room was hushed except for the steady rhythm of ventilators and the soft beeping of monitors. Beds lined the walls, each containing a small body fighting its invisible war. Alexander slowed his steps, absorbing the gravity of where he was. Sophie led him to the third bed by the window. There lay Emily Carter, no older than 4. Her skin was pale, her cheeks hollow, and a central venous catheter peeked from beneath the hospital gown. Her tiny chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. "She's sleeping," Sophie whispered, placing the broken doll gently beside her sister's arm. "See? Now she won't be scared." Alexander's throat closed. He had signed off on medical research budgets that ran into hundreds of millions, had ordered expansions of oncology wings in cities across the country. But here, Before this frail child, numbers meant nothing. He was still staring when a calm, professional voice spoke behind him. "Are you family?" Alexander turned. A woman in her late 30s stood there, her dark hair tied back neatly, a stethoscope around her neck. Her ID badge read, Dr. D. Laura Bennett, Pediatric Hematology Oncology. Her eyes, though weary from long hours, carried a quiet strength. Alexander hesitated. "I brought her sister." Dr. Bennett nodded, her gaze lingering on Sophie. "You shouldn't be out so late, young lady, but I understand." Then she turned to Alexander. "I assume you're here for Emily's case?" Alexander frowned. "Her case?" Dr. Bennett gestured for them to step aside, away from the bed. Lowering her voice, she explained, "Emily has acute lymphoblastic leukemia. It's aggressive, but with the right treatment, her chances could improve. We had been running a clinical trial here, a promising protocol with a novel immunotherapy agent." She paused, her jaw tightening. "But the trial was suspended last month. Lack of funds." "Suspended?" Alexander's voice sharpened. Dr. Bennett nodded gravely. "Without access to the investigational drug, Emily is left with standard chemotherapy. It helps, but it's not enough for her stage. The trial gave hope to dozens of children like her." She hesitated, then added, "Your company was the primary sponsor, wasn't it? Reed Global Holdings?" Alexander felt the words strike like a gavel. His mind raced through the corporate reports he had signed without a second glance. He had seen the hospital's name in one of those thick binders marked Research and Development Philanthropy Allocation. It had seemed straightforward then, a line item in a sea of figures. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "My company funds it." Dr. Bennett's eyes studied him carefully, as if measuring the distance between his tailored coat and the fragile children around them. "Then you must know why the funding was pulled." He shook his head. "No, I don't. Because they told us the budget was exhausted, that the board redirected resources elsewhere. But tell me." She folded her arms. "Do you really expect me to believe a corporation with billions under management can't find money for a trial that saves children's lives?" Alexander's chest constricted. He wanted to protest, to insist he hadn't known, but the words caught in his throat. He thought of Richard Cole, his CFO, assuring him earlier that every dollar was accounted for. That philanthropy was just another line of goodwill. And suddenly, he remembered Sophie's trembling voice in the alley. "She's never had a real toy before." He looked back at Emily's small form, the doll resting by her side. "What does she need?" Alexander asked. Dr. Bennett's voice softened. "The trial drug. Without it, her prognosis is limited." She glanced at Sophie, who was watching them intently. "She doesn't understand the details, but she knows when we run out of hope." Sophie reached for Alexander's hand, her little fingers once again curling around his. "You said you'd help," she whispered. The words pierced deeper than any accusation. Alexander inhaled slowly, fighting the chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. For years he had measured success by towers and contracts, by applause in boardrooms. But here, success was measured in heartbeats, and one little girl's chance to hold on to life. He nodded once, a vow forming inside him. "I'll find out what happened, I promise." Dr. Berchier, Bennett searched his eyes for a moment, as though trying to determine if he was another executive making empty assurances. Then she gave a small, cautious nod. "If you mean that, Mr. Reed, then children like Emily may still have a chance." Sophie leaned closer to her sister's bed, brushing Emily's small hand with hers. The monitor beeped steadily, each pulse a fragile reminder that time was slipping. Alexander stood there, a man who had mastered markets, but not mercy. realizing that tonight his life had crossed an unmarked threshold, and there would be no turning back. Morning light spilled over the glass towers of Manhattan, gilding the skyline Alexander Reed had once considered his personal kingdom. From the corner office of Reed Global Holdings, the view was meant to inspire awe. Central Park spread like a frozen quilt. The East River glittered with winter light, and traffic pulsed like arteries feeding the city's restless heart. Yet Alexander stood at the window with no sense of triumph. His reflection looked back at him. Impeccable suit, salt and pepper hair, and eyes shadowed by a sleepless night spent replaying Sophie's words and Emily's fragile breaths. He had always believed that wealth brought clarity, that numbers never lied. But now, the truth seemed buried beneath layers of polished glass and signatures. He turned abruptly, striding toward the conference room. Today, he needed answers. Inside, the board of directors gathered around a polished mahogany table. Suits and silk ties, watches gleaming under recessed lights, the usual theater of corporate power. At the head sat Richard Cole, the company's chief financial officer. Richard was 10 years younger than Alexander, his smooth face perpetually fixed in a polite smile that never reached his eyes. "Morning, Alex," Richard said, rising slightly from his chair. "We weren't expecting you so early." "I wasn't expecting to be here either," Alexander replied curtly, pulling out a chair. His voice carried the weight of command that silenced the small talk immediately. Richard's smile tightened. "What's on your mind?" Alexander leaned forward, his palms flat on the table. "The New York Presbyterian Pediatric Oncology trial. Why was the funding cut?" A ripple of discomfort passed through the directors. Richard raised his brows innocently. "Ah, that. The hospital mismanaged the funds, Alex. They overspent their allocation. We reviewed their quarterly reports. Completely reckless accounting." "Reckless?" Alexander's voice dropped, low and sharp. "Do you know what I saw last night? A 4-year-old girl in the ICU, dying, because the trial was suspended, and her sister scavenging in a Brooklyn alley for a broken doll because she thought it might comfort her." The room fell still. Richard's smile faltered, but only for a moment. "That's tragic, of course, but hardly our responsibility. We can't be held accountable for how the hospital chooses to allocate its budget." Alexander's jaw tightened. "That's not what I asked. I asked why our funding vanished." Richard spread his hands, a gesture rehearsed for investor calls. "All funds are accounted for. Look at the reports. Transfers were made as contracted. If the hospital diverted them, that's on them." Alexander's gaze swept the table, studying the eyes that refused to meet his. Shadows lingered in every corner of this room, men and women who owed their fortunes to him, yet suddenly seemed united in their silence. "You're telling me," Alexander said slowly, "that Reed Global, a corporation managing billions, cannot explain why millions earmarked for a children's leukemia trial evaporated?" Richard chuckled softly, the kind of laugh designed to diffuse tension. "Alex, philanthropy is goodwill. It buys us headlines, not accountability. If New York Presbyterian can't handle their end, maybe we should redirect to a more photogenic cause." The words landed like a slap. Alexander felt the room tilt, not from dizziness, but from rage held barely in check. He saw Sophie's frost-bitten hands gripping the doll, Emily's fragile chest rising beneath tubes, and realized that in this polished chamber those images meant nothing. He slammed his hand on the table. "This isn't about headlines. It's about lives." The directors stiffened, startled. No one raised their voice in this sanctum, not even him. But Alexander didn't care. Richard, however, recovered quickly. "You're letting sentiment cloud your judgment. You've always been pragmatic, Alex. Don't let one emotional night derail years of strategy." Before Alexander could reply, the doors of the boardroom creaked open. Heads turned, frowns etched on polished faces. It was Sophie. She stood in the doorway, small and out of place among men in tailored suits. Her red sweater was too thin for the winter morning, her sneakers damp from melted snow. She clutched the ragged doll to her chest like a shield. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice carrying across the room. "I got lost. I was looking for Mr. Reed." The silence that followed was brutal. Some directors exchanged disbelieving glances. Others smirked, as though the intrusion itself confirmed their disdain. Richard's lips curled faintly. "And who might this be?" Alexander rose at once, crossing the room to her side. "She's with me." His voice was iron. "Her name is Sophie Carter." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes wide but steady. "You said you'd help Emily," she reminded him softly, her words innocent but cutting through the corporate fog like a blade. The directors shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the theater they signed up for. Richard's smile hardened. "Alex, this is hardly appropriate. Bringing guests to a board meeting?" Alexander placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, shielding her from the table of predators. "Appropriate? You want to talk about appropriate? This child's sister is dying because someone in this company decided money meant for medicine could be treated like loose change." His voice rose, resonant, unyielding. "So no, Richard. Don't lecture me about appropriateness. Lecture me about where the money went." For the first time, Richard's expression cracked. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of calculation behind them. Then he leaned back, steepling his fingers. "If you're accusing me of impropriety, Alex, be careful. Words like that in front of the board have consequences." The challenge hung in the air, sharp as glass. Alexander held his gaze, unflinching. "So does stealing from dying children." The room was thick with silence, the kind that precedes storms. Somewhere in the corner, the clock ticked, indifferent. Sophie pressed closer to Alexander's side, her small frame trembling, though her voice was steady when she whispered, "Don't let them hurt Emily." Alexander bent slightly, just enough for her to hear. "I won't," he promised. But as he looked back at Richard and the board, he knew this battle had only begun. The shadows in this room were darker than he had imagined, and somewhere among them, the truth was waiting to strike. Morning light spilled down Fifth Avenue, coating the mirrored facades in pale gold. From the 54th floor of Reed Global Holdings, Central Park looked like a quilt of white stretched under the winter sun. Alexander stood before the glass, still hearing the rhythmic beep of the monitor he had listened to all night at New York Presbyterian. He drew a breath, turned, and pushed open the door to the boardroom. The room stretched long and gleaming, paneled in walnut, lit by recessed LEDs. At the far wall, a massive screen displayed a dashboard of projects, betas, and cash flow graphs. 12 directors were already seated: pension fund managers, hedge fund partners, a former cabinet secretary. And at the head of the finance delegation sat Richard Cole, burgundy tie, silver pen in hand, his smile thin as a blade. "Good morning," Alexander said, his voice calm but edged. "Before we follow the agenda, I want to add an item: the pediatric oncology trial at New York Presbyterian." Chairs shifted uneasily. Richard leaned forward, smooth as ever. "We've reviewed it. The hospital overspent its allocation. Reckless accounting. My team recommended suspension until they comply with restricted funds protocols." Alexander held his gaze. "Restricted funds showed a balance in the last quarterly report. Why does the hospital insist the account is empty?" A pension fund director shrugged. "Hospitals always dramatize. As long as our Form 990 and audit reports are clean—" "No," Alexander cut in, fingers drumming the table. Last night I stood in the PICU. I watched a 4-year-old girl struggle to breathe. I heard her physicians say the trial was suspended because the money was gone. She mentioned Reed Global by name. Richard twirled his pen, voice silky. Alex, I respect your emotions, but governance is governance. Philanthropy isn't a blank check. My department identified misallocation. Do you have evidence? Alexander asked, tone low and sharp. Yes, Richard replied instantly. He tapped his laptop and the screen filled with transfer diagrams. Arrows pointed from pediatric trial to operations/admin. Next to them glowed the word amendment. Alexander narrowed his eyes. And who signed this amendment? You did, Richard said. The words detonated in the silence. Alexander's pulse thudded. I never signed that. A director coughed. Perhaps an assistant executed it through DocuSign. No, Alexander said flatly. I personally review every philanthropic amendment. Richard tilted his head, voice softening into mock reassurance. We're facing macro headwinds. Adjustments aren't abandonment. PR will handle it. We can redirect toward oncology survivorship programs, far more photogenic. Something inside Alexander cracked like ice under strain. Photogenic? He leaned forward, each word sharp. We don't buy headlines. We fund treatments that save lives. The air grew dense. The board secretary's eyes flicked nervously toward the frosted glass door. Outside, the carpeted hallway was quiet, employees moving like muted currents. No one noticed the small figure in a red sweater drifting past the blurred glass. Alexander straightened. I want a forensic review of every philanthropic transfer over the past 12 months, especially those tagged administrative or operations. Convene the audit committee this afternoon. And Richard, I want original copies of every amendment bearing my signature. Richard's smile faltered, but held. Are you questioning the finance department? I'm defending this company's approval chain, Alexander snapped, and the children whose names don't appear in this room. Another director interjected carefully. We're bound by Sarbanes-Oxley. If there's misconduct, whistleblower policy will trigger independent auditors. Exactly, Alexander said. And we start now. He nodded to the secretary. Suspend finance's access to reallocation functions. Mirror the email server. Place a legal hold on every file referencing pediatric funds. Preserve chain of custody. Richard gave a low laugh. Alex, this isn't the FBI. No, Alexander said, eyes like steel, but it will be if necessary. Murmurs rippled around the table. A hedge fund director finally sighed. Support the forensic review. PR risk is catastrophic if this leaks. Alexander closed the matter like slamming a door. Then it's settled. 4 o'clock audit committee. Reschedule whatever you must. He left the boardroom, silence following like a shadow. The hallway outside was hushed, lined with monochrome photographs of New York landmarks. And at the far end, under a frame of Grand Central Station, a small girl stood, red sweater too thin, sneakers damp from snow, clutching a battered doll. Sophie. She looked up, eyes wide. I'm sorry, she whispered. I got lost. The guard said I could come up. I just wanted to give you this. Alexander quickened his pace, scanning the hall. Empty, except for her. He knelt to her height. You shouldn't be here alone, Sophie. These halls are full of people who don't understand children. She nodded solemnly, then pulled a folded scrap of paper from her pocket. The nurse said, if something strange happened, I should tell you. She said people in suits asked about me and Emily, asked if Mommy left any papers. She told me to give this to you. Alexander unfolded it. Ink scrawled hastily. Don't trust amendments. Check the signature. Check the admin float. M.H. Margaret Hill, he muttered. His throat tightened. He looked back at Sophie, who stood nervously twisting the doll's torn sleeve. His voice softened. You did exactly the right thing. Thank you. At that moment, the boardroom door opened. Leather shoes clicked on marble. Richard emerged with two directors, speaking lightly. His gaze landed on Sophie. He paused half a second too long. Charming child, he said, tone neutral. Whose is she? She's with me, Alexander answered, voice like a shield. Richard's eyes lingered on Sophie, then slid back to Alexander. The smile never reached them. He nodded and moved on, but Alexander caught the calculation flickering behind his expression, the kind of glance a predator gives a piece on the chessboard. When the hallway cleared again, Alexander placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. We're going back to the hospital. Emily needs you. Sophie bit her lip. Are they mad at you? I'm not afraid of that, Alexander said. And to his own surprise, it was true. I'm only afraid of one thing. People using children like you to cover their mistakes. Together, they walked toward the elevators. Their reflections stretched across the glass wall, a man in a dark suit, a girl with a broken doll. Distorted by the glass, but clear enough to reveal one truth, his course was set. In the elevator, Alexander called his general counsel. Lock finance out of reallocation functions. Legal hold on all pediatric fund emails. Keywords amendment, admin float, trial. Bring in an outside forensic accounting team immediately. But Mr. Cole, the voice hesitated. I'll take responsibility, Alexander said. Tell them I'm protecting fiduciary duty. The doors opened to the lobby. Cold air rushed in as he guided Sophie out, hand firm around her shoulder. Outside, the driver waited. Mr. Reed, Sophie whispered as they climbed into the car. Will you lose to them? Alexander turned, saw the question in her eyes. It wasn't about money, but about promises. He gave a small, unforced smile. No, he said, because this time I'm on the side of the truth. And the truth, though slow, always arrives. The car merged into midtown traffic. Glass towers gleamed above them, facades polished and untouchable. But to Alexander, they were no longer fortresses. They were surfaces, and surfaces always crack when the truth knocks long enough for it. He texted Dr. Bennett as Sophie leaned against him, half asleep. I've ordered a forensic audit. Keep Sophie and Emily in restricted access. If anyone unusual asks for them, alert security and call me. Message sent. He glanced down at the child's steady breathing, at the patched doll clutched in her hands. He didn't yet know what secrets it held inside. But he knew this. The walls of glass were already trembling, and he was ready to bring them down. The storm had followed Alexander back to his penthouse, sweeping across the Manhattan skyline with flurries that streaked the glass like chalk lines. He should have been exhausted, but instead he stood over his desk, the city glowing below like a restless circuit board. The scrap of paper from Nurse Margaret Hill lay beside him. Don't trust amendments. Check the signature. Check the admin float. He spread out the internal reports his legal team had delivered after the hurried data lock. They were thick binders of transfers, approvals, and philanthropic memos. He flipped page after page until his eye caught something strange. A supplemental folder tucked inside, its tab labeled simply, Carter, Sophie, Carter, Emily. His hand froze. This wasn't supposed to exist. Reed Global didn't keep personal records of individual children. Philanthropy was aggregated. Orphan care, community support, patient assistance. Not names, never names. He pulled the folder free, opened it, and felt the ground shift beneath him. Inside were photocopies of case files from the New York City Administration for Children's Services, placement histories, foster home reports, notations scribbled in the bureaucratic shorthand of social workers, words like placement instability, absconded, behavioral issue leapt off the page. He read one note twice, his jaw tightening. Sophie refuses separation from younger sister Emily, displays unusual resilience. Attachment disorder suspected. Attachment disorder. He shook his head, bitter. What some caseworker had seen as pathology, Alexander had witnessed as loyalty, Sophie refusing to let her sister face the world alone. He turned another page and found the accident report. Their parents, Daniel and Grace Carter, construction workers killed instantly when scaffolding collapsed on a site in Queens. The photo showed hard hats lying in dust, yellow tape flapping in the wind. Workplace accident, the file said. Alexander knew better. He had seen enough cost-cutting cover-ups in his career to hear the unspoken truth. Ignored safety standards, buried reports, contractors bribed into silence. He shut the folder for a moment, pressing his palm flat against the cover. Somewhere in the shadows of Reed Global, someone had gathered this file. Not out of compassion, not for charity, for convenience. Because the next line chilled him more than the accident report. Current status, children absconded from last foster placement. Location, unknown. Unknown, until a freezing alley in Brooklyn. He sat back, breath shallow. Someone inside his company had been tracking Sophie and Emily not as children, but as assets. Their lives turned into camouflage for disappearing money. A perfect shield. Who would audit line items marked orphan support? Who would question expenses hidden under the faces of two little girls no one was supposed to find? The realization burned like acid. He didn't hear Sophie until she spoke from the doorway. "You're still awake." He turned sharply. She stood there in her red sweater, hair tangled from sleep, doll dangling from one hand. She patted in quietly, climbing onto the armchair across from him. "What is it?" he asked gently, closing the folder halfway. She peered at the stack of papers. "That's our names." "Yes," he admitted. "It's everything the system has on you and Emily. Where you lived. What happened to your parents?" Her chin lifted, small but fierce. "They always tried to split us up, said it was better. But it's not. Emily needs me." Alexander leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "You're right. She does. And you need her. I promise you, Sophie. I won't let anyone tear you apart." For the first time since he had met her, she allowed herself a flicker of relief. It was brief, but real. She nodded, hugging the doll tighter. The next morning, he carried the file to Dr. Batia Bennett's office at New York Presbyterian. She scanned the papers, her brow furrowing. "This isn't standard," she said. "Why would your CFO's office request children's social service files?" Alexander's jaw clenched. "That's what I want to know." She tapped the margin where orphan support was stamped. Unless the children were being used as cover. Philanthropic cases are hard to audit. Label a transfer as charity for orphans, and it disappears into fog. No one questions it. Her voice hardened. "If this is true, Mr. Reed, then the corruption isn't just financial, it's predatory." He felt his stomach twist. Sophie and Emily, already burdened with loss, reduced to numbers in a fraudulent ledger. "Then we expose it," Alexander said grimly. Later that evening, he drove Sophie back to his penthouse. She pressed her face against the car window, staring at the skyline rising like frozen stars. "Is this where you live?" she whispered. "Yes," he admitted. "It looks like a castle." She paused, eyes still wide. But castles can be lonely. The words pierced deeper than any financial loss. He had built towers of glass and steel to shield himself after his wife's death. Now a 6-year-old named the truth in a single sentence. Inside, Sophie wandered carefully, sneakers squeaking on the marble floor. She stopped at the grand piano near the window, brushing her fingers across the keys. "Do you play?" Alexander asked. She shook her head. "But I pretend." She pressed a note, and the sound echoed through the cavernous room, filling it with a ghost of something almost forgotten. He watched her, realizing she brought more life into the space than any art piece or skyline view. Later, when Sophie finally slept curled on the couch beneath a cashmere throw, Alexander sat alone at his desk. The orphan file lay open before him. He traced the faded photograph of Daniel and Grace Carter, two ordinary parents smiling on a job site, unaware of the tragedy to come. He whispered into the silence, as though to them, "I should have known, but I know now, and I will not let your daughters be erased." Outside, Manhattan pulsed indifferently, glass towers glittering in the storm's aftermath. But Alexander Reed no longer measured success in steel or profit margins. Tonight, success was this vow. Sophie and Emily Carter would not remain shadows in a file. They would be daughters. The underground garage beneath Reed Global was half empty at midnight, a cavern of concrete echoing with the drip of water and the hum of fluorescent lights. Alexander's footsteps echoed as he crossed toward his black Mercedes. The briefcase in his hand felt heavier than any boardroom report. Inside it lay the orphan file and copies of the forged contracts he had pried loose from his company's archives. He was supposed to wait for his driver at the front entrance. Instead, he had asked to be left alone, needing a moment to breathe, to think. It was a mistake. A metallic clang rang out, sharp against the still air. He turned. 2 men stepped from behind a pillar, their coats dark, their faces obscured by the shadows. One held a steel pipe. The other flexed his fists like a boxer ready for the bell. "Mr. Reed?" the taller one called, voice casual, chilling. "You've been asking questions you shouldn't." Alexander gripped the briefcase tighter. "Who sent you?" The shorter man smirked. "Let's just say the people who sign your paychecks prefer quiet. Drop the file. Forget the girls. Walk away." His pulse hammered. "Children are dying because of your theft," he said. "You think I'll walk away?" The taller man's grin twisted. "Last chance." He lifted the pipe. They lunged. Alexander ducked as the pipe smashed against the side of his car, sparks shrieking from the metal. The second man shoved him into a concrete pillar, knuckles poised. Instinct more than training saved him. He drove his shoulder into the man's ribs, staggering him back. But the pipe swung again, and this time it grazed his arm, the pain searing. "Police! Drop it!" The command cracked through the garage like thunder. All 3 froze. A figure advanced from the ramp, gun drawn, badge flashing under the harsh lights. Detective Sarah Monroe. She moved with precision, stance solid, her voice carrying the kind of authority men obey. The attackers cursed. They retreated quickly, shoes slapping the concrete as they bolted for the stairwell. Sarah didn't chase. She kept her aim steady until the echoes vanished, then lowered her weapon. "You're lucky," she said, holstering it. "Another 10 seconds and you'd have been on a stretcher." Alexander straightened, breath ragged. "Who the hell are you?" She flashed her badge. "Detective Sarah Monroe, Brooklyn Financial Crimes Unit." Her eyes, sharp and assessing, flicked to his briefcase. "I've been tailing you for weeks. When you showed up at the hospital, you stirred the hornet's nest." "You know about coal," Alexander said. Her expression hardened. "I know your CFO's been laundering money through offshore accounts. disguising transfers as pediatric charity. I know whistleblowers in his orbit keep going quiet. And I know tonight was your welcome message. Alexander opened the briefcase just enough to show her the contracts. These are forgeries. My signature. I never approved those transfers. She scanned the pages quickly, lips tightening. This is good. Very good. But it puts a target on your back. And not just yours. What do you mean? Her gaze sharpened. Children like Sophie and Emily. They're listed in those files, right? Alexander's chest constricted. Yes, but how would you— Because I've been following the money trail, Sarah cut in. Cole's people buried millions under orphan care allocations. Sophie and Emily aren't just names, they're liabilities, loose ends. If they know the truth, they'll use the girls as leverage. The garage suddenly felt colder. Alexander imagined Sophie clutching the ragged doll, Emily's tiny chest rising under hospital machines. He had promised to protect them. Now he understood the cost. What do I do? His voice came rough, not with fear for himself, but for them. Sarah's answer was immediate. Witness protection. Get them out of sight until we build a case airtight enough to bring Cole down. The FBI has a safe house in Queens. You come too for now. We'll keep rotation tight. He shook his head, jaw clenched. Emily's in the ICU. She can't just disappear. Then we protect the hospital room like it's a vault, Sarah replied. Restricted visitors, guards on rotation. You want her alive? That's the only option. For a moment, Alexander pressed his palm to the briefcase, feeling the weight of the evidence, the weight of his vow. They'll come again, he murmured. Yes, Sarah said flatly. And harder. But that means we're close. Cole's empire is shaking, and desperate men make mistakes. Alexander looked into her steady eyes, recognizing the resolve of someone who had stared into shadows before. Then we bring it into the light. Sarah gave the faintest nod. Welcome to the real fight, Mr. Reed. The next morning, Alexander stood once again in Emily's hospital room. Sophie was at her sister's bedside, reading aloud from a picture book, her voice soft, determined. The doll rested beside Emily's arm, patched and fragile, its button eye catching the fluorescent glow. When Sophie saw him, she looked up quickly. You came back. I always will, Alexander said. He crouched, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. Sophie, I need you to listen carefully. Some people may try to hurt you and Emily, but Detective Monroe and I won't let them. Her eyes widened. Because of the money? Yes, he admitted. Because of the money. She hugged the doll tighter. Then we won't let them win. For all her 6 years, she spoke with a conviction that humbled him. He pulled her gently into his arms, feeling how light she was, how fragile, and yet how strong. Behind him, Sarah stood at the doorway, conferring quietly with hospital security. Guards were already being stationed at the elevators, visitor lists cross-checked. The ICU was becoming less a ward and more a fortress. For Alexander, it was not enough. He looked down at Sophie, then at Emily's pale face. I made you a promise, he whispered. And I keep my promises. He turned back to Sarah. Whatever it takes. We take Cole down. We end this. Her reply was steady, unwavering. Then let's finish what we started in that garage. Outside, Manhattan's towers glittered in the winter sun, but their shine could not hide the cracks spreading through Richard Cole's empire. The shadows were stirring, and this time, Alexander Reed was no longer the man behind glass walls. He was the man ready to shatter them. The winter morning wrapped the steps of the Southern District of New York in silver light. Outside, cameras flashed, reporters shouted, and signs waved. Protect our children. No more blood money. The press had already given the case a name: the doll trial. A CEO accused of robbing dying children, a CFO turned cooperating witness, and whispers of offshore accounts disguised as charity. Inside, the smell of polished wood mixed with the rustle of papers. Alexander sat straight-backed at the defense table. His suit remained perfect, but his eyes carried weeks of sleepless nights. Across the aisle, the prosecution team arranged their files with brisk confidence. Behind them sat Richard Cole, his tie sharp, his smile thinner than glass. Judge Harold Whitman banged his gavel. "Court is now in session." The prosecutor began like a surgeon cutting open a chest. "This case is about greed dressed up as generosity. Mr. Reed diverted millions from a pediatric oncology trial. He forged amendments with his signature. He enriched his image while children languished." On the screen, diagrams appeared. Transfers marked Operations Admin, amendments stamped Signed Reed. Each slide hammered another nail into his reputation. Then came the dagger. "Our cooperating witness, CFO Richard Cole, will testify that these reallocations were made under Mr. Reed's direct instruction." Richard lowered his eyes with the performance of humility. To the jury, he looked repentant. To Alexander, he looked like the architect of betrayal. Finally, the judge turned. "Mr. Reed, do you wish to respond?" Alexander rose, voice low but steady. "Your Honor, those signatures are forgeries. I never authorized these transfers. I was deceived, just as this court was deceived." Judge Whitman raised a hand. "Evidence, Mr. Reed." "Accusations are not enough." The gavel fell. Recess. The marble hallway was colder than the courtroom, echoing with footsteps. On a bench, too small for the cavernous corridor, sat Sophie. Her red sweater was too thin, her sneakers damp from snow. The patched doll lay heavy in her lap. "You said they would listen," she whispered when Alexander approached. "They will," he said, kneeling beside her. "We have to show them the truth." "They believe the man with the smile," she murmured. "Richard." The words cut deeper than any cross-examination. He took her trembling hand. "Do you trust me, Sophie?" She nodded, hugging the doll tighter. Then she looked down at it. "Dolly feels heavier. Nurse Margaret told me, if I ever had something strange, I should hide it where no one looks. I sewed it here." Her small finger traced the clumsy stitching across the doll's belly. Alexander's breath caught. At that moment, Detective Sarah Monroe strode down the hall, laptop bag slung across her shoulder. "Consultation room," she said briskly. "Now." In the small attorney consultation room, Sarah donned gloves. Carefully, she cut open the doll's seam. A tiny USB drive slipped into her palm, black, ordinary, but heavy as a stone in Alexander's chest. "Nurse Margaret thought ahead," Sarah murmured. If she'd handed this to an adult, it would have been seized. But a child's doll? Invisible. She plugged it into her laptop, running in offline mode. Hashtag software blinked green. She opened a folder. Transfers, shells, approvals, emails. One email subject line glared up at them. Sarah clicked. "Push another 2 mm through the pediatric fund. No one audits dying kids. Reed signs whatever we put in front of him. Richard Cole." The words scorched the screen. Alexander's hands curled into fists. Sarah scrolled further. Encrypted transfers to Cayman Shells. Beneficial owner, Richard Cole. We'll hand this straight to FBI Cyber and the SEC. But first, we move for chain of custody, sealed evidence, in-camera review. Alexander exhaled shakily. "Then let's do it." Back in the courtroom, the defense attorney rose. Your Honor, the defense moves to submit newly discovered digital evidence received lawfully from a whistleblower. We request the device be sealed, placed under custody of the U.S. Marshals Service, and scheduled for in-camera review with certified forensic experts. Objection! The prosecutor shouted. This is last-minute fabrication. Detective Monroe stepped into the witness box, flashing her badge. Sarah Monroe, Financial Crimes Unit. I personally retrieved the device, created a preliminary intake log, and secured it offline. I am prepared to hand it over for official sealing. Judge Whitman studied the courtroom, then nodded. Overruled. Marshal, secure the exhibit. Chain of custody is established. In-camera hearing tomorrow morning. A U.S. Marshal stepped forward, sealed the USB into an evidence bag, signed the log. The sound of the seal clicking shut echoed louder than the gavel. Richard shifted in his seat, eyes narrowing, calculation flashing like a predator searching for an exit. Court is adjourned until this afternoon, the judge said. We resume with cross-examination of the cooperating witness. Evidence hearing tomorrow. The gavel fell. Back in the hallway, Sophie still sat on her bench, doll stitched empty in her lap. She looked up at Alexander. Dolly doesn't have to keep secrets anymore. Alexander placed a hand over hers. No. From now on, the grown-ups will keep them safe. She searched his face. Will they listen tomorrow? Yes, he said, because tomorrow the truth will knock on the courtroom door. And truth, though slow, always arrives. Sarah leaned against the window, phone pressed to her ear. FBI Cyber and SEC tomorrow morning. Metadata verification, IP logs, digital signature analysis. I want the chain of custody read aloud in open court. She hung up, her voice steady. Cole knows the drive slipped through his fingers. He'll strike out before he sinks. Alexander tightened his grip on Sophie's hand. Through the frosted glass, he could see reporters swarming on the courthouse steps. The headlines tomorrow would change. But right now, what mattered was the child beside him, her faith holding stronger than any verdict. He whispered, so only she could hear. I promised Emily. And I keep my promises. The hallway clock chimed softly. The day closed not with victory, but with order. Evidence sealed, hearings scheduled, and a fragile thread of trust knotted tighter between them. Tomorrow, the wood-paneled room would fall silent again, and in that silence, the truth would speak. The storm outside had eased, but inside the safe house in Queens, the air was still tense. The unmarked van had brought them there under cover of night. Alexander, Detective Sarah Monroe, and 2 federal agents. Sophie dozed in the back seat, her doll pressed to her chest, while Emily, bundled in blankets, leaned against her sister's shoulder, her breaths shallow but steady. The safe house was plain, an old brick duplex with blinds drawn tight and a faint smell of fresh paint. Inside, agents checked windows and phones, setting up secure lines. It felt less like refuge and more like a bunker, a place for survivors waiting out a storm that hadn't yet passed. At the kitchen table, Sarah slid the USB across to an FBI cybercrimes specialist. Everything's here, she said. Emails, transfer logs, shell companies in the Caymans, forged approvals. It all ties back to Cole. The agent, a wiry man with sharp glasses, plugged it into his laptop. Lines of code and spreadsheets bloomed on the screen. He whistled softly. This is a gold mine. Not just embezzlement. This is racketeering. Wire fraud, money laundering, securities violations. SEC will have a field day. Alexander leaned forward, his eyes scanning the evidence that had almost buried him. What about the signatures? Can you prove they're forged? The agent nodded. Already did. Metadata shows the signature PDFs were digitally cloned. The IP trace points to Cole's executive assistant's terminal, not yours. With chain of custody intact, this will stand up in federal court. Relief surged, but it was short-lived. Then why do I feel like we're still losing? Alexander murmured. Sarah closed her notebook. Because Cole isn't the only player. Look here. She tapped one of the files. It wasn't just Cole's name. There were transfers routed through secondary entities, Hamilton Equity, Orion Trust, Red Shore Consulting. Shell companies layered like Russian dolls, each masking the other. These aren't just Cole's pet projects, Sarah said. This is a network. He had help. Bankers, lawyers, maybe even people on your board. Alexander's chest tightened. How deep? Deep enough that children became camouflage, Sarah answered coldly. Emily and Sophie weren't just names in a file. They were line items used to justify missing millions. From the couch, Sophie stirred, rubbing her eyes. Are you talking about us? Alexander turned, softening his voice. We're talking about people who tried to use you and Emily to hide their lies. But we found them out. She hugged the doll closer, frowning. That's why the nurse gave me this. Sarah crouched beside her. Exactly. You kept it safe when no one else could. You were braver than most adults. Sophie looked down at the doll, running her fingers over the stitching where she had hidden the drive. It was just Dolly. No one cared about her. Alexander swallowed hard. Sometimes the things no one cares about are the ones that change everything. The FBI agent interrupted. Grim. Mr. Reed, you need to understand. This evidence doesn't just expose Cole. It paints a target on anyone connected to it. If they know these girls were the chain of custody, they'll try to eliminate that link. Alexander stiffened. They'll come after Sophie and Emily. Yes, Sarah said, which is why this safe house is non-negotiable. No contact outside authorized channels. Agents on rotation. If Cole's network is as big as it looks, they'll come hunting. Sophie's small voice cut in. Trembling, but firm. They can't take Emily. She's all I have. Alexander moved to her side, kneeling so his eyes met hers. And you're all she has. That's why I won't let anyone touch either of you. Do you believe me? Her eyes glistened, but she nodded. Later, after the girls had drifted to sleep in the upstairs bedroom, Alexander stood by the window with Sarah. Snowflakes drifted past the glass, catching in the faint glow of a street lamp. Do you think they'll ever be safe? He asked quietly. Sarah folded her arms. When Cole is in prison, when his network is dismantled, when the system stops treating children as disposable line items, then maybe. Alexander exhaled, gaze fixed on the sleeping city beyond. I've spent my life building towers of glass, thinking that was legacy. Now it feels like everything I built was a shield for men like him. Sarah's voice softened. Legacy isn't towers, Reed. It's what survives when the glass breaks. Right now, it's two little girls upstairs who believe you'll keep your word. He turned to her, steady. Then I'll make sure I do. The following morning, federal agents escorted Alexander back to Reed Global under protection. His office, once a sanctuary of power, felt like a stage rigged with traps. He locked the door, pulled the shades, and began combing through the digital archives again. That was when he found it, a hidden subfolder buried in a philanthropy account labeled innocuously as Community Outreach. Inside were more orphan files, not just Sophie and Emily, but a dozen others. Children from foster homes across the city, names used like chess pieces to mask transactions. He slammed the laptop shut, bile rising in his throat. This wasn't just embezzlement. This was exploitation dressed as charity. That evening, back at the safe house, Sophie met him at the door, her doll clutched tight. "Did you fix it?" she asked. He looked down at her, the weight of the discovery pressing against his chest. "Not yet," he admitted. "But I will. And when I do, no one will ever use your names again." Sophie studied him for a long moment, then climbed into his arms, resting her head against his shoulder. "As long as we're together, I'm not scared." Her words steadied him more than any contract, any quarterly report, any tower of glass. He glanced toward Emily's room, where her breathing machine hummed softly, steady as hope. The shadows were closing in, but Alexander Reed knew this. He was no longer just a man defending his reputation. He was a father defending daughters. And he would bring the hidden evidence into the light, even if it meant burning his empire to the ground. The Southern District Court of New York had hosted mob bosses, Wall Street fraudsters, and politicians disgraced by their own ambition. But that January morning, it braced for what the press had dubbed the doll trial. Outside, the plaza was chaos. Cameras flashing, protesters chanting, headlines already drafted. "Protect our children," one banner read. "No more blood money," read another. Inside, the wood-paneled courtroom vibrated with tension. The gallery overflowed with journalists and families of sick children whose lives had hung on that suspended trial drug. Everyone came to see whether Alexander Reed, builder of Manhattan's glass towers, would collapse, or whether the empire itself would fracture from within. At the defense table, Alexander sat still. He looked less like a billionaire CEO and more like a man carrying a vow. Behind him, Detective Sarah Monroe and 2 FBI agents sat like anchors, their presence a reminder that this case was no longer about boardroom politics. It was about federal crimes. Across the aisle, Richard Cole wore a polished suit and an even more polished smirk. He had agreed to testify against Alexander in exchange for leniency. To the jury, he hoped to appear as a reluctant truth-teller. To Alexander, he was still the man who had stolen from dying children. Judge Harold Whitman entered, his gavel cracking through the hum. "Court is now in session." The prosecution opened first. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the lead prosecutor began, pacing slowly before them. "This case is about betrayal. Mr. Reed presented himself as a philanthropist. But behind that mask, millions meant for children's cancer research disappeared. Our cooperating witness, CFO Richard Cole, will testify that these funds were redirected at Mr. Reed's command." The jury leaned forward, drawn by the gravity of the charge. Richard was called to the stand. He adjusted his tie, performed his part with oily smoothness. "Mr. Reed demanded reallocation," he said. "He wanted splashy press releases. He told me children's hospitals didn't move markets. I objected, but he insisted." A few jurors frowned at Alexander. His stomach churned. Every word was a lie, sharpened for effect. Then it was the defense's turn. "Your Honor," the attorney said, "we call Detective Sarah Monroe." Sarah took the stand, swore the oath, and opened her folder. "I personally received a whistleblower tip leading to the recovery of a USB device hidden for protection. Chain of custody was preserved and handed to federal agents. FBI cyber and SEC forensic experts verified the data." The technician connected a monitor. Emails and financial ledgers filled the screen. The attorney pointed to one. "Detective, please read this." Sarah read steadily. "Push another 2M through the pediatric fund. No one audits dying kids. Reed signs whatever we put in front of him." Gasps erupted in the gallery. The jury stiffened, their pens scratching furiously. "And who authored this email?" the attorney asked. "Richard Cole," Sarah replied. "Verified through metadata and IP traces to his executive terminal." The defense pressed further. What about the signatures on the so-called amendments? Digitally cloned, Sarah answered. Not executed from Mr. Reed's office. Again, forensic metadata points to Mr. Cole's system. Richard's composure cracked. Sweat gathered on his temple. Those are fabrications, he started. The judge hammered his gavel. Mr. Cole, you will not speak out of turn. The defense attorney turned like a blade. Mr. Cole, would you like to explain why millions transferred into Cayman accounts list you as the beneficial owner? The screen lit up again. Bank ledgers, shell companies peeled back one by one, all roads leading to Richard Cole. The prosecutor tried to object, but the judge cut him short. The evidence stands. The jury shifted, the weight of realization breaking across their faces. Finally, Alexander himself took the stand. He didn't look at Richard or at the prosecutors. He looked at the parents in the gallery, some holding faded photographs of their children. He looked at the jury, but most of all, he remembered Sophie's whisper in the hallway. Don't let them hurt Emily. I built towers of glass because I thought success was measured in steel and profit, he said quietly. But then I met two little girls searching through the trash for a broken doll. They taught me that real success is measured in heartbeats. Someone I trusted turned their suffering into cover for theft. That is the true crime here. And I will spend the rest of my life ensuring no child's name is ever used that way again. The courtroom fell silent. Even Judge Whitman seemed moved. Deliberation took only 3 hours. The foreperson stood. On all counts of fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering, we find Richard Cole guilty. The gallery erupted. Bailiffs cuffed Richard as he shouted in protest, his polished facade shattering under the weight of chains. Judge Whitman struck his gavel. Order! This court dismisses all charges against Mr. Alexander Reed. You are exonerated. Relief surged through Alexander. Not triumph, not victory, but relief. As he stepped into the hallway, reporters swarmed, microphones jabbed, questions flew. Mr. Reed, what comes next? Alexander paused. The winter air stung his lungs, but it cleared his voice. What's next? Protecting the children this company forgot. That's my future. That's my legacy. The cameras flashed brighter, but Alexander hardly noticed. From the corner of the hallway, Sophie peeked out from behind Sarah's coat, her doll stitched back together, her eyes shining with cautious hope. Their gazes met. She gave the smallest nod, fragile faith, but faith nonetheless. And for the first time in years, Alexander Reed walked out of a courthouse, not as a CEO defending an empire, but as a man ready to defend his daughters. Behind him, the U.S. attorney announced that the FBI and SEC would continue investigating the broader shell network. Richard Cole was only the first domino to fall. But for Alexander, justice had already begun, measured not in headlines, but in the trust of two little girls who had broken his empire of silence. The headlines from the doll trial burned bright for weeks, but by spring, the frenzy had shifted to other scandals. Richard Cole remained behind bars as investigators traced his offshore network. Reed Global's board was under federal review, but Alexander Reed was no longer chasing headlines. He was chasing hope. Every evening, after leaving meetings with auditors and lawyers, he returned to the same room in New York Presbyterian's pediatric ICU. Emily still lay in her narrow bed, frail but no longer fading. The reinstated immunotherapy trial had resumed under strict oversight, and for the first time in months, her numbers began to stabilize. The doctors spoke cautiously. Remission was a word too fragile to use, but they admitted the treatment was working. Alexander sat by her bed with Sophie curled against his side, reading aloud from storybooks or, sometimes, from the Wall Street Journal. Sophie always interrupted with the same question, "But does this help Emily?" And Alexander always answered, "Yes, Everything I do now is for both of you. In New York family court, a more modest chamber awaited him a few weeks later. No marble columns, no television crews, just beige walls, wooden benches, and the smell of paper and coffee. Yet the weight of the proceedings pressed heavier than any trial before. Judge Mary Ann Clark adjusted her glasses as she reviewed the file. Mr. Reed, you are petitioning for emergency guardianship of Sophie and Emily Carter. Yes, Your Honor. You understand this is temporary. You will be able to consent to medical decisions and provide legal authority until a home study and a guardian ad litem report are completed. I understand. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. Why you? Alexander's voice caught, but he forced it steady. Because when I met Sophie, she was digging through trash in the cold to find a broken doll for her sister. No child should carry that burden. And when I saw Emily in the ICU, there was no one to sign for her treatment. I have built towers of glass and steel, but these girls showed me what truly matters. I can give them stability, safety, and a father's protection. The judge turned her gaze to Sophie, who sat on the bench clutching her doll. Do you want this man to be your guardian? Sophie's chin trembled, but her voice was firm. Yes, because he keeps his promises. The gavel struck. Emergency guardianship granted. Review hearing in 3 months. It wasn't adoption, not yet, but it was recognition. The law had finally put shape to the vow Alexander had already made in his heart. By March, snow melted from Brooklyn's streets, and Emily was discharged from the ICU. Her cheeks had gained a touch of color, her hair returning in soft wisps. She still needed regular hospital visits, daily medications, and close monitoring, but she was strong enough to leave. That night, Alexander didn't take them back to his sterile Upper East Side penthouse. Instead, he unlocked the door to a modest brick townhouse in Brooklyn. The floors creaked, the kitchen smelled faintly of paint, and the backyard was barely wider than a fire escape. But it was filled with sunlight and warmth. This isn't a castle, he told Sophie as he set Emily's bag down, but it's a home. Sophie wandered through the rooms, fingers brushing over walls and windows. Finally, she placed the patched doll on the mantel above the fireplace. Dolly doesn't have to protect us anymore, she said solemnly, because now we have you. Emily, pale but smiling, nodded from her wheelchair. Alexander's throat tightened. He lifted Emily onto the couch, and Sophie climbed up beside her. The fireplace crackled to life, casting them in amber light. Are we really a family now? Emily whispered. Alexander kissed her forehead. Yes, we are. And soon, the court will say so too. Sophie laid her head on his shoulder. Then I don't need to look in trash cans anymore. He closed his eyes, holding them close. Never again. 3 months later, the family returned to family court. The guardian ad litem report praised Alexander's devotion. The home study described a warm environment. Dr. Bennett testified that Emily's health was improving under consistent care. Judge Clark smiled as she read the findings. Mr. Reed, today this court recognizes you as the adoptive father of Sophie and Emily Carter. The words struck harder than any verdict of innocence. Alexander bent down, tears blurring his vision, and pulled both girls into his arms. Sophie laughed through sobs. Emily clung to his suit. For the first time in years, he cried freely, not from loss, but from gratitude. Outside, spring sunlight washed over the courthouse steps. Reporters waited, but Alexander ignored them. He carried Emily in his arms while Sophie skipped beside him, her doll swinging happily. For decades, he had measured legacy in towers of steel and glass. Today, his true monument was far humbler and infinitely greater. 2 little girls who finally had a father to call their own. They were, at last, home. Thank you for staying with us until the very last chapter of The Doll in the Trash. This story reminds us that true legacy is not built in glass towers, but in the simple act of keeping promises to those who need us most. If this journey touched your heart, we'd love for you to subscribe, so together we can keep sharing stories of hope, healing, and unexpected family.